My historical context presentation covers the Irish potato famine, also known as the Great Famine. It lasted from 1845 to about 1852, and it was really a time of starvation, disease, and immigration for the Irish people. So in my presentation, I'm going to cover a few main points. First, the causes and contributing factors of the famine, the reaction it caused in Ireland, the effects of the famine on the Irish people, and also the effects of the famine from the British, charity from others during the famine, the 1848 rebellion, and the aftermath. So to begin with causes and contributing factors, I will kind of talk about the social causes of the Great Famine, and England had a huge role in that. Because England had conquered Ireland and took control of large amounts of agricultural territory. And since they were still in England, they rented land to the Irish people to farm. But there was just too much competition because too many Irish people needed to farm and there was just not enough land. And the landlords lived too far away because they were still in England, so they had other people taking care of their land in Ireland. And so there was a lot of chaos and no one to really enforce rules amongst farmers. And another huge thing is that they would not rent land to Irish Catholics. And Irish Catholics made up 80% of the population of Ireland at that time. So all those people could not buy land that was owned by the English people, which took a huge toll on them. And then half of all land holdings were less than 5 acres, which is a really small amount. And so people struggled to even feed their family. So they were not able to sell a lot of their crops or pay their English landowner for their rent. So another huge contributing factor to the Great Famine was Ireland's potato dependency. Plots were so small that no other crop could feed a family. Like I said, most of the plots were only 5 acres, which wasn't near enough for the large families at that time. And someone figured out that they could grow triple the amount of potatoes as they could grain on the same amount of land. So a lot of people instantly started growing potatoes opposed to grain. And half of the Irish population depended on potatoes for food, which is a huge amount for the little amount of land that they were actually able to farm. And not only did people depend on potatoes for food, but livestock did as well. So they had a lot of people and animals to feed on a small amount of agricultural land. So the probably most popular and talked about contributing factor of the Great Famine is the natural disaster that occurred. And that was that a blight struck the potato plants in September of 1845. And somewhere between 1/3 and half of the potatoes were destroyed by that. And that caused the potatoes to rot and become black within a few days of harvest. So they would pick them, and then when it came time to eat them, they would see that they're black and filled with diseases. And so that actually made them impossible to eat. And it's believed that the disease came from North America via trade ships, because there was a lot of trade going back and forth at that time, and a lot of people going to North America that they think somewhere it developed over there, and then someone brought it back to Ireland. Okay, so more on the blight, since it was such a big deal. Scientists at that time could not stop the blight. They really had no idea what it was, where it came from, or anything that could fix it. But the harvest did improve in 1847, so people believed that the famine was over, that the blight was gone. But then that next year there was a relapse in 1848 in the 1849 harvests, and that caused the second period of the famine, which was just as bad, if not worse. And it struck very harshly until 1850. Farmers first thought it was an every other year blight, so they thought it was gonna go away right away, but then it never did. And after 1850, it was much less effective, but it did last until about 1852, just not near as bad as the first couple years. I have listed here the scientific name for the blight. Scientists figured out what it was and named it about 40 years after the famine, so they were not very helpful in fixing the problem. But they do know now that it was a type of fungus that attacked all the plants, and a cure to the fungus has now been found, so if the fungus was ever to strike plants again, I guess they'd be able to fix the problem right away. So thank goodness for modern science. Alright, focus on the reaction in Ireland for a bit. The Great Famine caused widespread panic throughout all of Ireland, because of the extreme food shortages and illnesses that were going around. Everyone was terrified that they were going to be the next one to die. And also, everyone had a different reason for why the blight had struck Ireland, because they did not know it was a fungus at the time, so they thought maybe it was God's punishment, or maybe it was God helping them. They weren't really sure. And there was anger with food exports to England, because the corn laws restricted such high taxes on exports that the English people did not lower them or really feel bad for the Irish, and so the Irish people could not get across what exports they needed to make any money. And there was such inflation of food and goods throughout Ireland, because there were so few materials, and the prices just skyrocketed. And then because of the poverty, no one had the money to pay for them, so there caused a lot of problems there. And then there was confusion in regards to malnourished and sick. No one had really seen as much illness or the illnesses that were going around Ireland. And the doctors did not have the training or medical technology to deal with all the people, and there was a lot of death. And they could no longer pay rent to British landlords, because they weren't able to sell their crops, and what they did have, they had to pay for their own food. And the British people did not really feel much empathy for them, and the landlords still expected their money. And that caused a lot of the Irish people to go broke or go homeless, because they could not get their money across to the English people who they ran their farms from. So to go into a little more detail on the effects of the famine on the Irish people, the price of potatoes more than doubled because there weren't enough of them. And starvation began bad after the 1846 harvest. People didn't grow the potatoes they needed to feed their families, and no one was able to pay for potatoes to give to their families. And then after the second famine period, which I talked about earlier, which was in 1848 and 1849, disease really hit Ireland hard. Cholera and typhus spread rapidly throughout Ireland, and elders and children were most affected. And like I said, doctors really had never seen these illnesses, and they didn't have the medical technology to help the people out, so it really was a bad deal. Famine and disease together killed 1 million Irish people, which is a huge amount. It was actually about 12% of their population died, so that is a crazy number to think about, and so it really affected the Irish people badly. So more effects of the famine on the Irish people. Like I said earlier, the Irish were not able to pay their British landlords, and so that did cause eviction. And so hundreds of estates were auctioned off to British landlords who still had the resources to pay for them and still expected rent from the Irish people that were going to farm them. But because the Irish people did not have the money to rent or buy the land, the British landlords cleared the agriculture space for cattle. The British took a harsh approach to poor families living on their new land. They still expected a lot from them and taxed them and expected a lot of rent, even though they knew that the Irish people did not have the resources. And so between 1848 and 1849, a lot of Irish families were evicted and left homeless. And so in the cities, there was a huge homeless and poverty problem because there wasn't enough land to farm. And the British people expected just far too money for the Irish people to keep up with what they were dealing with. And another huge effect of the famine on the Irish people was immigration. Around 1 million Irish immigrated during the famine period because of the poverty and illness in Ireland. And most of them went to North America, Britain, and Australia. They flooded the cities in mass numbers, and they basically just took over cities because they all mostly lived and moved together, so there'd be a huge Irish incoming. And if you think about the 1 million that died and the 1 million that immigrated during the famine period, that's leaving Ireland about 2 million short of what they initially had at the beginning of the famine, which is a huge number for the people that lived there back then. To talk about the effects of the famine and how the Irish government was involved, The Corporation of Dublin attempted to find public money to better the economy, but money was so scarce amongst the public that they really failed to raise any significant funds that could help people out. Ireland's elected representatives were powerless as members of the British Parliament as well, because as Irish people, they did not have much say and much authority within the British Parliament, so they weren't able to help there. And they also had very little ideas and power and resources to help out the people of Ireland, which was a big problem. And another problem was laissez-faire. And the policy of laissez-faire meant that governments did not interfere in business markets or the economy in general. And this policy was terrible when the famine struck because it meant there was no way of quickly fixing the crisis. And so food was very scarce and it cost too much and the poor just ended up starving. And so the government was basically helpless when it came to helping out the people of Ireland during the time. So the effects of the famine from the British eventually did do things to help out the Irish, but the British government was extremely delayed in providing any relief for them. At first they caused the potato they termed the potato the lazy crop, and they really failed to see the importance with it. They thought the famine wasn't going to last very long, and they also kind of saw it as God's punishment acting down on the Irish, and so they really didn't have much concern at first. Eventually they set up soup kitchens and job relief. Almost all of those failed because of the English baking crisis, which also took place at that time. They had to focus on British internal problems opposed to Ireland's. And many did not want Irish to become too dependent on the British, and so they were pretty hesitant when it came to saying what they should do to help out the Irish people. So more from the effects of the famine from the British. At the beginning of the famine, the British still had the Corn Laws, and those were laws enacted to keep up the price of British-grown grain by imposing heavy tariffs on all imported grain. And it made it too expensive to import grain from other countries, especially during the famine, because under the Corn Laws, large amounts of cheap foreign grain needed for Ireland would be far too expensive for them to buy. And the Irish lacked money to buy any imported grain, so that's really where a lot of their starvation was coming from, just because they couldn't purchase any of their needs with these laws. And the British Prime Minister eventually repealed the Corn Laws, which was not a very popular thing of the time because people thought Britain was going to lose money and the Ireland people could handle things on their own. And the repeal of the Corn Laws came a little too late because it was done over 3 years. So if it would have came sooner, it would have helped a lot. But it did not help a huge amount just because by the time they were actually all gone away, the famine was just about over at that point. Alright, the charity from others to help out the Irish people during the famine. Key one was the British Relief Association, which raised money in North America and England. They sent lots of letters to Queen Victoria reaching out for money. They were somewhat successful because Queen Victoria did send money over to Ireland to help them out. There was also religious organizations. For example, the Central Relief Committee of the Society of Friends, which were Quakers, and they went around donating money, or raising and donating money throughout Europe to send to the Irish people to help them out. And then the Ottoman aid, which is a kind of interesting one, came from Ottoman Sultan from Turkey, and he sent food and money, and it is rumored that he was going to send much more food and money, but Queen Victoria reached out to him and told him that she was sending less money than him, and she didn't want to look bad, so asked him to send less money than he originally was, which is kind of interesting. And then the Choctaw Native Americans, which were from the North America at the time, also raised some goods to send over to Ireland to help the people out, which I thought that was kind of another interesting one, that the Native Americans in North America would go through the effort to help out the Irish people. Just to mention the 1848 rebellion which took place, it kind of shows the frustration of the Irish people at the time. It's called the Young Ireland Rebellion because it had a lot of young people that were involved. It called for exports of grain to be stopped. They said we need to stop sending our food away to Britain and other parts of Europe and keep the grain local and feed all the Irish starving people. They had lots of meetings and a few uprisings, but they failed pretty quickly just because they did not have the support that they needed to keep it going. But their ideas were well taken in by the Irish people because a lot of people agreed that they need the food in Ireland and not Britain. Next, I want to talk about famine aftermath. There was a lot of effects on famine culture from the famine. For example, there's a lot of bitterness towards the British for their delayed help. For many years after the famine, the Irish people thought that England, who was supposed to be their big brother and really looking out for them, didn't do enough to help them in their time of need, nor did they care very much, which also convinced the Irish people that there was a need for political change. A lot of the things they did had to go through the British Parliament, and the Irish government during the famine wasn't able to do much to help out the Irish people, which made them see that they need a stronger government and they needed to do things differently. It also changed agriculture. They no longer farmed on the small plots. They farmed much larger plots that they were able to both feed their family and sell some of their crops for profit. And there was a new concept of crop rotation. So they no longer just farmed one crop every single year, which a lot of people think kept the famine going, was that they kept farming potatoes over and over again. And so they switched crops up, which made the crops a lot healthier and their harvests were a lot better. And just to show the famine aftermath by the numbers, the population went from 8 million to 5 million in a matter of 3 years, which is an outrageous number. And I have a little map here that shows the population, and you can see in Central Ireland they had over 30% fall between 1841 and 1851, and that was just crazy to think about that so many people could leave their country based on what was happening there. Lastly, I have my bibliography page here, and I won't really talk much about that, but hopefully everyone got all the information that they need about the Irish potato famine. Thank you for listening.